Okay, guys, so this is sort of moving away from, we spent some time developing aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, thinking about policy, and then, how we extended it, thinking about long run versus short run. Um, what I want to talk about now is, again, at the macro level, looking at international trade. And this is something you may or may not have covered in your micro class. I would cover this in my micro class. So really the first part of this is more at the micro level, understanding, why do countries trade with each other? Why do we see that? What are the advantages? And, strictly speaking, from an economics perspective, it only makes sense if trade can make everybody better off. So that's one of the principles of microeconomics. That trade only makes sense if you think of two countries, if both countries are better off. Because if one country is better off and one is worse off, then obviously it's not going to exist. And so when you think of the United States as a huge economic power, then why does it make sense that the US trades with so many other countries? Wouldn't it make more sense that the US just is self-sufficient, i.e. grows its own food, produces its own goods, and why bother trading with anybody else? So we're going to look at that. So this diagram here shows the United States right in the middle, and the green arrows are exports. So those are goods that are produced in the United States and sold to other countries, while the red arrows are imports. And again, those are goods that are produced in a different country but imported into the US. So you can see that there's a big export market with Canada, also Mexico. You export a large amount of goods to China, but also you import more from China than you export. Japan, you export a lot and import a lot. The UK, you tend to import quite a bit from, so you clearly have these relationships with all these different countries. So we're going to talk about, again, the first part of this is to understand, why we see trade exist internationally. And so we're going to use an example. And in our example, we'll try to keep it as simple as possible, in which we have two countries, the United States and the UK, and two goods. Obviously, in reality, there's multiple countries and thousands of goods, but that's far too complicated. Let's just keep it as simplistic as possible. Two countries, both producing two goods. And we'll just constrain this to one resource. Of course, there are many resources: land, labor, capital. But again, the more that we include, the more difficult the analysis becomes. So we'll just look at one resource, labor. That's the number of workers that a country has. And what we're going to look at is sort of two scenarios. We're going to look at what if the country chooses to be self-sufficient, that is, the country produces all of its goods for itself, and what if the country decides to trade with the other? So what would happen in the US and the UK if they were self-sufficient versus what would happen if they traded with each other? And again, we're going to compare these two scenarios and just essentially see, what gives us the best result. So, the way we do this is through production possibility frontiers, which we've talked about in this class. Again, they'll show you the amount that a nation, in this case, can produce of two different goods given its resources. And so again, the resources here, let's start with the United States. The resource is labor, and the US has, we're going to say, 50,000 labor hours available to produce our two goods, computers and wheat. And the US takes 100 hours to produce one computer and 10 hours to produce 1 ton of wheat. And so if we graph what that looks like, so here we are graphing how much wheat can be produced with the 50,000 labor hours and taking 10 hours to produce 1 ton of wheat, and computers, again with the 50,000 labor hours taking 100 hours to produce one computer, we can graph different production possibilities. The easiest way to do it, because we're going to assume what's called constant opportunity cost, i.e. the production possibility frontier is going to be linear. So the easiest way to do it is just to sketch out the extremes. So if the US just produced wheat with its 50,000 labor hours available and 10 hours to produce each ton, then the most wheat it could produce would be 5,000 tons. However, if the US decided to just produce computers with the 50,000 labor hours and taking 100 hours to make one, the most computers it could make would be 500. So if we just sketch out those 2 points and draw a line between them, that's the production possibility frontier for the United States. And what it's showing us is, again, that just the different combinations of wheat and computer production that the US could produce given those 50,000 labor hours. Again, being efficient means it's producing some combination along this PPF. Anything inside is inefficient, anything outside is unattainable. So they want to be ideally somewhere along this PPF. So what would the US do if it didn't trade with the UK, if it decided to produce both wheat and computers for itself? Well, we would assume it would try and be efficient. So it's going to try and produce some combination along this PPF. And so just to kind of keep it as simple as possible, let's say it splits its resources down the middle. So half of its labor produces wheat and the other half will produce computers. And if it did that, then it would produce 2,500 tons of wheat and 250 computers. So that would be a point right there in the middle. Basically, I'm just picking a point in the middle of the PPF. It's efficient because it's on the PPF, and we're going to assume that's what the US does if it doesn't trade with the UK. Okay, but what about the UK, right? Smaller country, so doesn't have as many labor hours available. The UK only has 30,000 labor hours available every month, and it won't necessarily take the same amount of time to produce each good. In fact, it takes in the UK 125 hours to produce a computer and 25 hours to produce a ton of wheat. And just like we did for the US, I want to sketch out what the PPF looks like for the UK. So again, I would look at the extreme points. I would take the 30,000 labor hours divided by 125 to see at the most how many computers the UK could produce, and take the 30,000 labor hours divided by 25 to see at the most how much wheat the UK could produce. And if we do that and sketch it, we would see that they could make 240 computers or 1,200 tons of wheat, or again, any combination along that PPF. Once again, for the UK, we're going to assume that it's going to be efficient if it doesn't trade with the US. And just like we did for the US, I just want to pick that middle point. So again, I would assume it's not going to just make wheat or just make computers. It'll make a combination of both. I'm just going to pick the middle point. So it's devoting half of its resources to wheat and half to computers. And so when we do that, it can make 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. That's a point right there in the middle of the PPF. So now we know what both nations would do if they do not trade with each other, if they try and be self-sufficient. Now, thinking about trade then, before we even get into that, we want to look at the question, well, should they trade? And maybe one way of looking at that is looking at, do we see an absolute advantage for either country? That is the ability of one country to produce the good using fewer inputs than the other one. Or another way of thinking about it, with the same amount of resources, which one could produce more of one or two goods. So you think about the numbers. If you remember, in terms of wheat, the US takes 10 hours to produce a ton of wheat, while in the UK it's 25 hours to produce a ton of wheat. So the US can produce a ton of wheat quicker than the UK. Therefore, if they had the same amount of resources, the same amount of labor hours, the US would produce more wheat than the UK. And clearly when we looked at the PPF, we saw that the US could produce 5,000 tons of wheat, while the UK at the most could only produce 1,200 tons of wheat. So we would say the US has an absolute advantage in producing wheat. We would also say that the US has an absolute advantage in producing computers, because it can produce a computer in less time than they can at the UK. So again, with the same amount of resources, they could produce more computers than the UK. So in terms of absolute advantage, the US has an absolute advantage in producing both of these goods. So I think this begs the question, well, why would the US want to trade with the UK? If the US is a bigger country that could produce more of these goods than the UK, then what possible advantage could there be to the US from trading with the UK? And so maybe if I change the example, maybe if I had it that the US could produce more wheat and the UK could produce more computers, so the US has the absolute advantage in producing wheat and the UK has the absolute advantage into producing computers, that would make more sense. We could probably make the argument that I can see some advantages to trading, but that's not what we have here, right? That's not the situation we have in this case, where we have one nation, the US, with the absolute advantage in producing both goods. So again, the question is, does it make sense that we should see some trade? And what we're going to see is, yeah, it does make sense, because it's not about the absolute advantage. It's about what we call the comparative advantage. And what comparative advantage gets at is the opportunity cost. So it's not about how much you can make, it's the cost of making it. Who can produce which good at a lower cost? And again, cost refers to opportunity cost. And so comparative advantage, the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. And what we're going to see is, even if we have a nation like the US with an absolute advantage in producing both goods, therefore a nation like the UK with an absolute disadvantage into producing both goods, the UK will still have a comparative advantage in producing one of these goods. And so what we need to figure out is, all right, which good will the UK have the comparative advantage in producing, and which good will the US have the comparative advantage in producing? Because what we're going to see is those are the goods that the countries should specialize in, produce, and then trade with the other to get some of the other good, and then we'll see what happens when that occurs. So what we've got to do is understand the opportunity cost of producing both goods in both countries. And so I just put a table together, and what I'm showing here, again, the US and the UK, wheat and computers, and again, I'm showing those extreme points on the PPF. So the US could, again, produce either 5,000 tons of wheat at the most, or 500 computers at the most, or some combination in between. And here again for the UK, 1,200 wheat or 240 computers. Because what opportunity cost is, it's the slope of the PPF. And so to figure out the opportunity cost, you just got to calculate the slope. And so just go from one point on the PPF to another. And so this is why I give you the extreme points, so we can calculate the opportunity cost or the slope of that line. And so Let's look at the US first. In terms of wheat, what's the opportunity cost in the United States of producing 1 ton of wheat? That is, how many computers must the US give up every time it produces a ton of wheat? So how do you calculate that? Well, it's just the slope of that line. It's the rise over the run. It's what you're giving up divided by what you're getting. And so if you're thinking about wheat, to produce wheat, they would have to give up computers. And so if you imagine moving from a situation where you just make computers to just making wheat, what do you give up and what do you get? You would have to give up those 500 computers to get those 5,000 tons of wheat. So you're giving up 500 computers to get 5,000 tons of wheat. An opportunity cost is what you give up divided by what you get. So you're giving up 500 to get 5,000. So 500 divided by 5,000 is 0.1. So 1 ton of wheat, the opportunity cost is every time you make 1 ton of wheat, you're giving up 1/10 of a computer. That's the slope of the line moving from computers to wheat. And I did the same thing here in terms of computers. What's the opportunity cost in the United States of producing just computers? Then you just go the other way. Here you'd be giving up all of this wheat, 5,000 tons, to get those 500 computers. So 5,000 divided by 500 is 10. So the opportunity cost of 1 computer in the United States is the 10 tons of wheat that you must give up to make each one. And again, it's a straight line, so it's perfectly linear, so the slope is always the same. So every time you make 1 more computer in the US, you're giving up 10 tons of wheat. And over in the UK, we just do the same thing, but with different numbers. The opportunity cost in the UK of producing a ton of wheat is how many computers must I give up to make those tons of wheat? I must give up 240 computers to make those 1,200 tons of wheat. So 240 divided by 1,200 is 0.2. So in the UK, every ton of wheat, you must give up 0.2 of a computer. And the opportunity costs of producing a computer in the UK is the 1,200 tons of wheat you must give up to get those 240 computers. So 1,200 divided by 240 is 5. So finally, the opportunity cost in the UK of producing a computer is the 5 tons of wheat you must give up. So the whole point of doing this is we want to see for both goods which country has the lowest opportunity cost, i.e. which country has the comparative advantage in wheat and computers. So let's look at wheat. And I can see, if I compare these two numbers here, the US has the lower opportunity cost of producing wheat, because in the US, every time it makes 1 ton of wheat, it has to give up 1/10 of a computer. But in the UK, they have to give up 0.2 of a computer, 2/10. So the cost of making wheat in the US is lower. That's their comparative advantage. And for computers, you'll see the UK has the lower opportunity cost, 5 tons a week compared to 10 in the US. So that's the UK's comparative advantage. So in terms of comparative advantage, the US has the comparative advantage in producing wheat, and the UK has the comparative advantage in producing computers. So what we're going to say is that's what they should specialize in. And so that's what we're going to advocate. So what we're trying to do is, again, see, does trade make them better off? Will it increase the size of that economic pie? And what we're going to see is that if the country specialize in the goods in which it has the comparative advantage, then we should see gains to both countries. So let's go ahead and try and throw some numbers in and see what happens. So again, briefly to recap, like what's going on here? The US should specialize in producing wheat because it has the lower opportunity cost, i.e. it has the comparative advantage in producing wheat. Therefore, the US should specialize and make wheat. And if it does that, obviously it would make as much as it could. And based on our PPF, if you look back, you'll see again, the most wheat the US can make is 5,000 tons. The UK should make computers. Again, it specializes. It'll make as many as it can, and the most it can make are 240 computers. So what we're going to have is a situation with that the US has all the wheat and the UK has all the computers. So again, that's when they're going to trade. And of course, trade nowadays in reality means exchange rates, and so that's a bit more complicated. And so, if you go back to the day when, trade has been going on for a long time. It doesn't have to be just international trade. Back in the day, you would have your own individual household, and you would keep chickens and cows and grow some crops to feed yourself and your family, and other houses, other places would do the same thing. And at some point, there's a realization that those homes in the south are better at growing the crops because they have a better climate. But up here in the north of the region, we're better at keeping our chickens or producing something, making pottery, something like that. So we'll specialize in what we're good at, and they'll specialize in what they're good at, and we'll trade. So we'll trade some of your wheat for some of our chickens, or some of your wheat for some of our pottery. And so that's the sort of idea that we're going to look at here, because exchange rates just get a bit complicated. So we're going to say that the US produces the wheat and is willing to export 700 tons of wheat to the UK. And in return, the UK will export 110 computers to the US. And so we have these terms of trade. And we're not going to get into it, but essentially the terms of trade must lie in between the relative opportunity costs. And so in terms of computers, the opportunity cost was in the US, one computer, you give up 5 tons of wheat. In the UK, you give up 10 tons of wheat, so it's between 5 and 10. Here, the relative opportunity costs are about 7, right? 700 tons is worth 110 computers, so it's about a factor of 7. So our terms of trade lie in between the relative opportunity costs, but again, you don't have to know that. I would always just tell you how many units would be exported and imported. And so let's look, finally, what happens with trade compared to what happens without trade. And so I put together a table that kind of runs through all the numbers that we're working with. So we have, here be the countries, so we have the US and the UK. I've got 4 rows because in both countries we have 2 goods. Again, wheat and computers, wheat and computers. And we've already established what happens without trade. We said without trade, the US would lie along its PPF and produce 2,500 tons of wheat or 250 computers. In the UK, they'd make 600 tons of wheat and 120 computers. So that's what they would do if they did not trade. Now you said, all right, what if they do trade? Well, if they do trade, they're going to specialize, and you specialize in the good for which you have the lower opportunity cost. And so we figured out in the US that was with wheat, so they produce all 5,000 tons, and in the UK that's with computers, they would produce all 240 computers, and then they trade. And again, those are the numbers on the previous slide. So the US, we said, would be willing to export, that's a minus, they're getting rid of, exporting 700 tons of wheat, and in return, they're importing 110 computers. So in the UK, it's just the opposite. They're importing the 700 tons of wheat and they're exporting those 110 computers. Therefore, what happens after trade? So in the US, they produce 5,000 tons of wheat, they export 700, so they're left with 4,300 tons of wheat. They don't make any computers, they import 110, so they end up with 110 computers. In the UK, they don't make wheat, import 700 tons from the US, leaving them with 700 tons. They make 240 computers, export out 110, leaving them with 130 computers. Alright, so the final question is, what are, if any, the gains to trade? if we compare without trade to after trade, what do we see? And so in terms of wheat, with trade, the US ends up with 4,300 tons of wheat. If it didn't trade, it would get 2,500 tons of wheat. So in terms of wheat, it's better off, and it's better off by 1,800 tons. However, in terms of computers, if the US didn't trade, it would make 250 computers. But through trade, it ends up with 110. So it's actually lost. It's worse off in terms of computers by 140. In the UK, without trade, they had 600 tons of wheat. With trade, they get 700 tons of wheat. So that's 100 better off. And in terms of computers, without trade, 120. With trade, 130. So 10 better off. So the big question is, which country or are both countries better off through trade? Now, it looks fairly obvious to me that the UK is definitely better off through trade. It ends up with more wheat and more computers than if it didn't trade. So I would look at that and say, yeah, clearly the UK is better off. But what about the US? The US is better off in terms of wheat, but worse off in terms of computers. So it's harder to see for the US if trade is beneficial to them or not. And remember, trade must be beneficial for both nations for trade to exist. So the best way to look at it is go back to the PPFs. And we look at the US, again, these are the numbers that we used. They'd make 5,000 tons of wheat, they'd import and export, and this is how much of the two goods they'd end up with. So again, here's our starting point. Here's where they would be if they didn't trade. They would produce and consume 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. But then we said, okay, but if they do trade, they'd produce just wheat, all 5,000 tons, and then they'd export and import. And again, these are the numbers here we ended up with. And so what I want to do is I want to plot these numbers on this graph. And if we do that, 4,300 tons of wheat and 110 computers, we get this point right here. So this is the US point of consumption if it trades with the UK. And so again, the comparison is to compare this point to without trade. And so how do I know that this is a better place to be than this? Because again, when you compare the two, the with trade position is fewer computers but more tons of wheat. The reason I know that this position here with trade is better for the US than without trade is because this combination is outside of the domestic PPF. Without trade, the US could not possibly produce and consume this combination of the two goods. Because remember, the PPF is the limit. It's impossible to produce outside of your domestic PPF. But through trade, the US has managed to get to that point outside of the PPF. And so I know, looking at this, that trade is actually better for the United States. In terms of the UK, we knew that already. Again, I'm just going to throw those numbers up. Again, here's the comparison. For the UK, without trade right here, with trade right here, again, the UK is better off through trade because once more, it can consume a combination outside of its domestic PPF. So for both countries, they both managed to get to a point outside of their domestic PPF. So both nations are better off through trade relative to how they would be without trade. And so we would say here that trade is mutually beneficial to both nations. So this is why economists will advocate the idea of free trade. Trade makes nations better off. And so if you think about, the real world situations, we see the French, for example, produce a lot of wine. They have the right misty mornings, good alkalinity, west side of the mountain, all that kind of stuff that grows the best grapes to produce great red wine. So they produce a lot of red wine. Of course, the US produces red wine too, specifically the Napa Valley area. So certain countries, again, have this advantage. They have the right climate to grow crops and produce goods. So for the same reason, we see Caribbean nations producing a lot of fruit. They have the perfect climate. The Japanese produce a lot of high-tech goods, automobiles, etc., because they have the right infrastructure. They've accumulated capital and a highly trained workforce to allow them to do that. The US too, of course, up in Detroit, produces a lot of automobiles as well. Again, it has the capital required and the well-trained workforce. So we see this generally, that countries tend to specialize in the goods that they have this comparative advantage in. And so, do we see that in reality? Well, if you look at the example of Iceland, we can kind of see this, that a long time ago, they had a volcanic eruption that killed about a quarter of their population. And through the 1800s, they try to get out of that tough situation, and obviously realized that the ocean around them was full of fish, specifically cod, and the world likes to eat cod. It's a tasty white fish. So they started to fish for cod and exporting that around the world. So suddenly this poor country of people living, in dirt houses with very little contact with the outside world, improved their economic situation. They had some significant economic growth, that their lives were transformed and they became wealthier through specializing in fisheries. And so that was their comparative advantage. And you can't really compete with that. Obviously, if you're a landlocked country, you don't have access to these oceans. And even other countries with coastlines don't necessarily have cod teeming around like Iceland did. So Iceland specialized in what they were good at and took advantage of their comparative advantage. It led to economic prosperity. They were certainly better off through trade, better education, people's lives became better, economic growth, and did very well for themselves. But economies are dynamic, and we've talked about that. And so there's a problem with specializing in the fisheries, that a lot of fish populations are dying out, and cod is certainly one of them, because lots of nations have, do this in Britain too. They go out fishing for cod, and there's been some overfishing, and so Iceland's economic growth was declined somewhat because that specialization they had sort of mitigated over time. And so in the early part of the 21st century, Iceland just went into this international banking in a big way, and their unemployment rate fell to 1%. They did very well through specializing in international banking. However, some years later, the banking sector collapsed with the Great Recession, and so we need to find a new idea, something else to specialize in. And so I go back to the original diagram, and so this is the concept of international trade. And when we see all these imports and exports from one country to another, that's what they're doing. These companies are specializing in what they're good at through comparative advantage and trading with others. And again, by doing that, we're seeing that they're better off than they otherwise would have been.